This video is going to be a use case study on Surefire resources, the stock code ticker SRN. Now I'm going to cover a few tips here, like tip number 1, which is reading the financial quarterlies, tip number 2, which is the impact of the number of shares on the market, tip number 4, market capitalization, tip 6, finding the multi-bagger potential, and tip 7, the mining cycle. And of course, I'll cover the general theme of storytelling. Something that comes up in a lot of my videos is that you're not necessarily trading a stock based on its potential, but rather the story that you can actually tell. So a little bit of background about this stock. It was initially a vanadium-based company. It had a real strong vanadium focus. And around this time is when vanadium was breaking out. The actual commodity itself, it was pumping really hard. I think it had like 8-bagged at one point. It went from like $4 a pound to $35 a pound or something like that. So it rose exponentially. This stock failed to break out. It tried to here and sort of broke back down. I kind of broke out even and I just left it alone. I always paid attention to the quarterlies as they came out, sort of see what the company's up to. But that's just generally the gist of what was happening at SRN. It was a failed story of vanadium. The market didn't really take off with it and it kind of just dumped. So one day I came across this announcement on the 30th of June and it was pretty insignificant. It mentioned some vanadium stuff that they were really focused on. Wasn't too interested. There was just one thing that really stood out. And this is when the share price was 0.003. And this is that they had 8 meters at 10 grams per ton of gold. Now that I was pretty unaware of when I was looking into the vanadium. So 8 meters is an okay sort of thick intercept, right? It's not great, but it's not terrible either. You'll see a lot of companies when they hit high grade of 10 grams a ton plus, they'll have like a 1 meter strike, a 2 meter strike, and it's not that significant. An 8 meter is something that kind of raises eyebrows. It goes, right, well, there's potential here. So I kind of kept my eye on this stock, and it was purely this dot point alone that did it for me. Now, every time a quarterly activities is released, a quarterly financials document is also released. So you can see here, they weren't really spending much on anything. 6,000 on evaluation and exploration is basically nothing. Admin costs are relatively low. 85K is actually not a lot. So we scroll down, everything here is relatively insignificant. There's one thing that also stood out, is this part here. Now I don't typically see comments here, it's quite rare. It stood out mostly because it was in bold as well. And then total amount as required, that's an unusual way of phrasing it. I don't think I've seen this in any other 4C quarterly document. And what it turns out is that I think the managing director or one of the board members, Vladimir Nikolenko, I forget his exact role and position in the company, but off the top of my head, I think he was a managing director. And he was basically providing money to the company for drilling and exploration. So there was no real fear of capital raising because this guy would just raise the money and that's it. He would fund it through his own company that he had. Of course, that debt had to eventually be paid back, but it's really interesting to see. I don't think I've ever seen a company do this. He was basically a major shareholder has offered to provide a short-term loan. So I forget also what the percentage was. I think it was like somewhere between 6 to 13%. I know it's a broad range, but that's just off the top of my head. So that was really interesting to note. So based on what I was looking at in the quarterlies, I sort of mentioned on the forums that if the vanadium doesn't recover, which it never did, they could always turn to gold. And it wasn't too short after that, and mind you, I wasn't holding at the time. It wasn't too short after that post that I decided to buy. I bought it at 004. Now the reason I bought it at 004 is because of this announcement. This came from a company called Spectrum Metals, or SPX, and they had really high grade, right? Anything above 10 is considered high grade. So getting intercepts of 24 grams, 69 grams, all these grades are basically spectacular. They're a bit deep, 260 meters. I prefer anything under 100 meters. It makes it cheap, economic. You can have an open pit mine. But in this case, I was willing to overlook the depth because just the grades are so high. The intercepts, not that great. You got some 3 meters, some 2 meters, but there were enough longer strikes to make this really valuable. So we can have a look at the share price of SPX and what happened. So the share price boomed, right? It bagged a few times. I think it was 400% at this point. And we can see this is the 2nd of August right here, just as it peaked. SRN at 2nd of August had just barely moved. It just broke from 004 to 006. Now, the reason there's an association between SPX and SRN is this image here. This is the tenement map. It shows SPX here and their right to drill. And then you've got companies nearby like RXL surrounding the area. So they've got the right to drill and have 50 to 70% ownership, if I recall. And then you've got RXL here who also owned 100% of land here and down here. And then all the way up here, kind of out of the way, is SRN. Now let's have a look at what happened the day SPX released their results. People found out RXL was nearby, and it instantly moved. Oop. And it carried on. So it moved up 30% in a day, and then it just kept carrying on as SPX continued their announcements. So let's have a look at what happened on SRN. On the 29th of July, when that SPX announcement came out with the drill results, the share price didn't really move. There was a little bit of volatility, and I was kind of, not even volatility, it was just volume, and I was kind of regretting my purchase around this point. So I decided to sit on it and wait. And the reason I was kind of nervous about it is because there was no indication from management that there was going to be any gold discovery or drilling. They just mentioned they had historical grades. And that wasn't quite significant enough, but at least the company's aware, and this is the story that I was looking at, was that the company was aware that they did have historical grades of gold, and SRN as a company would be aware that SPX had these bonanza grade strikes as well. So for me, it was logical just to buy, sit and wait. Now I was hoping, I basically had my fingers crossed at this point, that at some stage in the near future, SRN would release an announcement that would target the drilling. Because we see what happened to the vanadium story. It dipped down and it went nowhere. Now we're seeing this move starting to go up. And in my mind, I was thinking management need to tell another story. This is related to my tip number 7 on the mining cycle, that when you run out of a story, you need to find a new story to tell. And this was the new story. Gold was breaking out. SPX had a nearology play, right? It wasn't too far away from XPS's land. And this was the move that eventually happened. SRN brought out an announcement that they're doing reverse core drilling of their gold project, which is, like I showed on that map, right next to SPX. Well, not right next to, but a little bit of a distance away. And they released this announcement exactly 1 month after SPX released their drill results. Now here's a key piece of information that was highly overlooked throughout this whole storytelling. There were 30 holes for 3,000 meters. That means the average hole would have to be about 100 meters deep. So we go back to SPX. How deep were the grades or the drill results? 250, 260, some close to 300 meters deep. We had the occasional strike that was close to 100 meters, and there was only one that was really highlighted for below 100 meters deep. This is quite important because people will look at this story of being next to SPX and they'll look at the grades and they'll really simplify the story. They'll convince themselves that this is going to happen to SRN. That's the story people want to fantasize about. So why is it so alluring that SRN could be like SPX in grades? Because this stock has 1.3 billion shares at around this time. And at 1.3 billion shares at 12 cents gives a market cap of $171 million. So consider this. If SRN hit the same grades as SPX, it could turn from a $1 million company to a $171 million company. So at 171 times, let's say you put in $5,000, you'd be at $855,000. If SRN reacted exactly the same as SPX and had the same grades as SPX, but of course SPX had their own thing going as well. They had other I guess, drilling and tenements and other things, but the fantasy is that SRN could be like SPX. That's the fantasy that people have, is buying this small, tiny stock and making it rich. So this is the story you're meant to trade. You're meant to find these glorious stories of hype and grandeur, of things that can make you rich. But as a trader, you're supposed to have enough common sense to know that 99.9% likely it's not going to happen. So you need to make money on the trade that happens. You need to trade that story. And that's the story you need to trade, is around this point here, or even around this point here at 007, where the company announced that they're actually going to drill for that gold. At this point down here, it was speculation that maybe they'll go for gold, but here would have been a solid buy as well, because you're buying this story that this could be a multi-million dollar company if those drill results come back, and they come back strong. So at this point in time, I'm sitting back watching the stock trade. Now it's moved up, it hit this resistance line here, come back down, and just try to break through again. Now this is where things get interesting. SRN decided to do a capital raising. On the 25th of the 9th, right here, the stock did a cap raise. The cap raise price was 009, so around here's where people would have an entry point if they bought into the capital raise. So they had quite a significant discount. So this is exactly where I sold. Because any trader worth their salt knows that if there's a capital raise coming, or if a capital raise has been done, the stock will 90% of the time come back down to that price, to the capital raising price. So in this case, it actually moved up a pip, which was kind of unusual, and then it slowly trickled down to 009. And it hovered there for a little bit. And this is where people kind of got a bit antsy. This annual report came out a couple of days after the capital raising, and I highlighted something quite interesting. There was a mention of Table 4, which was the historical drilling results. I pointed out that they mentioned and referred to Table 4 in the annual report, but for some reason it was missing. It was meant to contain the historical gold results, or the gold drilling results. And you'd think that's quite significant. And this is where they mention it in the announcement. It may contain high-grade inner zones, and this is the drill hole, YP780, formerly YR780, and then of course that it contains 8 meters at 10.2 grams a ton, which we saw that in the previous announcement, back a few months back. So we can see that there's a reference to this drilling table, but they didn't actually put it in the report. You can look it up yourself if you're that interested. And of course, there ends up being a revisement of the document. And the revisement comes out a couple of days later. And the interesting thing is, instead of adding Table 4, which has the drill results, they just removed all reference of Table 4, which was a big red flag. So I did 30 seconds of Googling, if that. And this is the drill results that were meant to be attached to the annual report. You can see the drill is actually not that great. We've got a lot of intersects here, 4 meters at 0.11 grams a ton. Anything under 1 gram per ton is basically meaningless. So we have drill results here that aren't great. We had previously a mention of 8 meters at 10.2 grams a ton from 20 meters, which is nice and shallow. But we can see the rest of the drill results were actually kind of garbage. So I stated my exit. I mentioned on the day, 1st of the 10th, that no point holding. There's 009 shares coming out from the capital raising. So there's no point holding something that'll just drop. So I outlined all my concerns, and of course you're going to have people like this that'll tell you that you're a down ramper. You're deliberately ramping up and down to profit. And apparently I'm nearly crossing legal boundaries. And that apparently I've hoodwinked a lot of people. So This is the kind of reaction to expect from people when they don't actually understand a stock. Some people, when they haven't put in the research, they buy the story because they're too lazy to do the research themselves. So you've got people that are like this, and I would encourage people to read the SRN forums and have a look at what people have said in response to what I've told them. They believe that just because I told a story, and mind you, that story is factual, everything I've said is genuine and true, and then telling them that I've sold out because there are multiple red flags, you get these kinds of people, and people will pile on and pile on. And these are the things that I mentioned before. Drilling results not being deep enough compared to SPX, historical grades being less than 1 gram per ton. The company is not releasing the table 4 of the historical grades, but removing them entirely. And of course, that there is cap raises. And cap raises typically flip money. Let's be honest here, if you're doing a capital raising on a micro cap stock and you buy into it, 95% of them are just going to sell, right? These people have big pockets. Typically, they spend $40,000, $50,000 plus on a micro cap stock worth $5 million. They're going to flip. They're going to take their 10, 20, 30% profit and get rid of it right away. They're going to take their money and laugh and move on to the next stock. Meanwhile, other people are just holding because they're the ones that believe the story. Now, I know how this comes across as tooting my own horn or showing that I'm so great at my research that I'm making correct decisions or whatever. And look, honestly, I don't come across that great when I post on forums. I really just cut to the point, and I don't have time to sugarcoat and baby people, so I can be a bit brash. But the point is that I make my case, and that's it. Take it as you will. Now, we can look at what happened just a few days later. The announcement came out, and just as I predicted, all the red flags turned out to be true. There were thin intervals of very low-grade gold strikes. These are all, or almost all, less than 1 gram per ton, which is pretty useless, right? You can't do anything with these grades. So let's have a look at what happened to the share price. It tanked more than half in a single day, and now it's sitting at 0.02. So there were people up in this range, and I was giving my reasons to why I exited, and I was doing it all the way down through to here. I wasn't making things up, I wasn't down ramping, so to speak. I was providing factual information about the stock from its own company announcements. And then what you'd see is this herd mentality. People who are too lazy to invest time in research all bandwagoned to each other's fantasy of making tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what I was doing was I was interrupting that fantasy, and I was giving sort of a sense of reality to what it could be. And this was the reality that I was trying to sell people, was this is actually what's going to happen if you hold this stock. Now, albeit I didn't do it in a very polite way, a bit brash and so forth, but I would encourage people to actually read the forums of SRN in this time period to get a real understanding of herd mentality and why you should absolutely neglect herd mentality. If you see a collection of people banding together and shutting down someone that doesn't share their point of view, take it with a grain of salt and be a little bit suspicious. So that's the end of this use case video. I've covered a range of tips that I've done in the past, and I've married them all together in order to show you an insight into how I trade a story, how I identify the story, how I pick my entry based on reasonable speculation, and how I choose my exit points based on the red flags that I identify throughout the trading of this stock.